The Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the Trump administration's approach to missing and murdered Indigenous women MMIW crisis. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and ranking minority member. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Good morning to you all. Today we'll be hearing directly from the Trump administration about its steps it is taking to confront the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Earlier this year, this subcommittee held a hearing where we heard from Native women who have witnessed this crisis firsthand and who are working on the ground to address it. I want to thank the ranking member for agreeing to look further into this issue in a bipartisan manner. I think I speak for both of us when I say how important it is to keep this issue in the spotlight. Before we begin today's hearing, I want to remind everyone why we are here. During our March MMIW hearing, we heard their names: Ashley Loring Heavy Runner, Mackenzie Howard, Ashlyn Mike, and Savannah Graywind. They are Native women and girls who went missing or were killed, and whose cases received shamefully negligent responses from federal and state agencies. Unfortunately, these women were not alone, and their cases are not unique. One study found that 1.5 American Indian and Alaska Native women experienced violence in their lifetime. On reservations, American Indian and Alaska Native women experience murder rates 10 times the national average. And as we learned at our hearing earlier this year, these numbers are likely underreported. We also know that state, local, and federal coordination and response to cases of violence against Indigenous communities is severely inadequate. In fact, federal enforcement has been so notoriously bad that some predators specifically target Native communities to avoid punishment. This pattern is sickening. These high rates of violence are not just a crisis affecting Indian country. It is a national disgrace that demands national action that has not appeared to be a high priority for this administration. We in Congress are committed to making change through VAWA, Savannah's Act, and other legislation. But we need to know we have a partner in the administration in working to curb that violence. Listening sessions are not enough. We need to know that what is being done to streamline protocols, eliminate lag time, improve databases, and combat apathy in our justice system when Indigenous people go missing. These are our brothers and sisters whom we have a responsibility to protect. I want to remind our witnesses here that the policies we discussed today have a direct impact on the lives of folks on the ground, for better or worse. I expect to hear about the tangible solutions this administration is pursuing to end the cycle of violence for Indigenous women in this country. Anything less is unacceptable. I would now like to recognize Ranking Member Mr. Cook for his opening statement. I'll go back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is the second part of the discussion. This subcommittee began in March of this year. At that hearing, the subcommittee received testimony detailing a painful situation that has plagued Native communities for far too long. Crime and violence, tragically, are not a new phenomenon in Indian country. 4 out of 5 Native women are affected by violence, with the U.S. Department of Justice finding that American Indian women face murder rates that are more than 10 times the national average. That's scary. American Indians are victims of violent crimes at a higher rate than the general population, which has led to the Department of Justice emphasizing the importance of law enforcement in Indian country. In April, the House of Representatives passed the Violence Against Women Act, which included many key provisions to protect Native American women, such as improving tribal access to federal crime information databases and reaffirming tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indian perpetrators of violence against women. I'm looking forward to these provisions becoming law. It is so important that we all work together to address these horrific crimes and find a way to end this unprecedented violence against Native women. I'm pleased we have some representatives from the administration here today. I'm looking forward to hearing what they're doing to combat the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Cook. Before we proceed to witness testimony, during our first hearing, our tribal advocates had a replica of the skirt that you see near our dais, and it was made by Native women, Agnes Woodward, originally from Canada, and married to a Mandan, Hitatsa, and Arikara nation. She makes these locally to bring awareness for the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Her aunt is among the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and Native women wear the skirts to remember their sisters. And please, if you'd like to just observe that we have that, and also like to give an opportunity to the chairman of the Committee of Natural Resources, Congressman Raul Grijalva, for any opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I think your statement and the statement of the ranking member and the bipartisan approach to accountability with regard to this issue, enough said, so thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now I'd like to transition to our panel of expert witnesses for today. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you choose. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please wrap up your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we question the witnesses. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Jeannie Hovland, the Commissioner for the Administration for Native Americans at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Cook, and esteemed members of the House Subcommittee for Indigenous People of the United States. It is my honor to be before you today on behalf of the Department of Health and Human Services concerning the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. My name is Jeannie Hovland, and I serve as Commissioner of the Administration for Native Americans. I am also a proud member of the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe, located in South Dakota. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, homicide is the third leading cause of death among American Indian and Alaska Native women between 10 and 24 years of age, and the fifth leading cause of death for American Indian and Alaska Native women between 25 and 34 years of age. And more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women, or about 84%, have experienced violence in their lifetime, as reported by the National Institute of Justice. We also know from research that children who witness domestic violence suffer long-term consequences, including changes to their mental and physical development, possibly resulting in worse health outcomes, leading to disorders, learning disorders, and continuation of cycle of violence over generations. These statistics are staggering and expose the deep impact violence has in the lives of Native women, families, and their communities. In July, President Bordeaux of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, located in South Dakota, issued a statement to his community that reads in part, "We have had a number of tragic deaths in the past 10 days. They were almost exclusively children. I know that we all grieve with the families and extend our condolences and prayers for comfort for the families impacted by these tragedies. No parent should have to bury their children. It has become obvious that it is a dangerous time for our people. It is especially true for our young people and our young adults who face many safety threats that were unheard of even 15 or 20 years ago. We now find ourselves in a situation where we need to be more vigilant about protecting the up and coming generation." End quote. Not surprisingly, what we heard from the urban Indian organizations is the resources and collaborations needed to address these issues include prevention programs, housing, data, and technical assistance and capacity building to form strong partnerships locally to address the multiple service needs of their most vulnerable clients. We have also heard from tribal leaders, service providers, and others about the importance of engaging with tribal community members to lead efforts in developing and implementing solutions. I am happy to share that HHS is leading efforts on primary prevention, intervention, recovery, and healing. Our efforts include a whole family approach that connects families to services that support the physical, mental, and spiritual health and well-being of individuals and families. Within ACF, programs such as the Tribal Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting, Head Start, Runaway and Homeless Youth, Family Violence Prevention and Services, and Healthy Marriage and Responsible Fatherhood are incorporating new practices to respond to trauma and domestic violence, raising awareness of the issue, and working to heal victims and their families. HHS has also created and funded resources that Native communities can access to serve populations vulnerable to human trafficking and MMIW. I have sought ways to be a visible advocate on behalf of Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Indigenous communities through reestablishing and chairing the Interdepartmental Council on Native American Affairs to enhance collaboration across HHS. Participating in work groups such as the White House Tribal Affairs Work Group, a federal interagency working group on women in trauma, and an interagency ad hoc working group, and partnering with the Department of Interior and Department of Justice. I recently joined Assistant Secretary Tara Sweeney and other federal and tribal representatives at a listening session focused on cold cases, violent crimes, human trafficking, and MMIW. In closing, tribal nations and Native communities in urban areas are ready to act to address MMIW, and HHS is ready to partner with them. We are thankful for the attention you are bringing to missing and murdered Indigenous peoples and the support of the subcommittee in helping address this crisis. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. The chair now recognizes Mr. Charles Addington, the Deputy Bureau Directory for the Office of Justice Services at U.S. Department of Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Good morning, Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Cook, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Charles Addington, and I'm the Deputy Bureau Director for the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Justice Services at the Department of Interior. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Department regarding the missing and murdered crisis confronting American Indians and Alaska Native communities. The Department has made a priority to address this crisis head-on. My testimony will reflect the current work that the Department is doing. With Native Americans facing alarming levels of violence across the country, more can be done to support meaningful efforts to address these high crime rates in Indian country. The Violence Against Women Act, the Tribal Law and Order Act have both helped bring attention to the high rate of violence and the gaps in crime trends in Indian country. However, significant gaps in data that exacerbate the crisis of missing and murdered Native Americans remain. These data gaps impact how law enforcement officials handle or follow up on these cases. These challenges are present across multiple sectors, but are particularly problematic in the context of criminal justice, in which federal, state, tribal, and local governments share responsibilities. It is important to continue efforts to build accurate data and provide Congress, the public, and most importantly, the tribes with the information needed to identify and analyze the criminal justice needs in any country to better address the crisis. Since the FBI Uniform Crime Report does not collect missing person data, the BIA Office of Justice Services has partnered with the DOJ's Missing and Identified Person System, named NamUs, a program of the National Institute of Justice, to create new data fields in their system to specifically capture tribal affiliation data. The new fields were implemented and went live in February 2019. This additional data will assist law enforcement agencies across jurisdiction with tracking and investigating missing persons throughout Indian country. The BIA Office of Justice Services has also begun efforts to raise awareness and provide additional training to Indian country law enforcement personnel. The BIA Indian Police Academy collaborated with the National Criminal Justice Training Center to create joint training programs for cold case investigations, long-term missing investigations, child abduction investigations for use throughout Indian country. This joint effort has resulted in over 300 Indian country law enforcement officers being trained to this date. The BI Indian Police Academy has also implemented missing person courses in our basic and advanced training programs, resulting in an additional 158 law enforcement personnel trained this year. In addition to the focused efforts of the BI Office of Justice Service, the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs Office has been directly engaged in 3 listening sessions within Indian Country and Alaska since June. Participation has included senior DOI leadership, the Domestic Policy Council, the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Administration for Native Americans, and the Department of Justice. In May, the inaugural roundtable was hosted by the Gila River community in Arizona. With the leadership of Governor Stephen Lewis, we were able to convene tribal leadership, the administration, and other stakeholders to engage in a discussion on reclaiming our Native communities. In August, we took the Reclaiming Our Native Communities Roundtable to Bethel and Nome, Alaska, to hear from Alaska Native communities. These face-to-face discussions between the administration and tribal leaders from throughout the United States was intended to highlight the department's commitment to promoting public safety in Indian Country and Alaska Native villages. The administration remains committed to partnering with American Indian and Alaska Native tribal leadership communities and other appropriate stakeholders to better ensure safety and economic prosperity in Indian Country. It is imperative that we continue to work in partnership and create safe communities and arrest the trend of issues plaguing our Native communities. I look forward to working with members of the subcommittee and Congress to address this important issue. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Addington. The chair now recognizes the Honorable John Anderson, the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Mexico.
Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Cook, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide insight into the Department of Justice's work on responding to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We appreciate your attention to this important issue and your efforts to understand the work being done to address it at an interagency level. At the heart of the Department of Justice's work in Indian Country, from law enforcement to prosecutions to policy development and program support, is aimed at addressing the unacceptably high rates of violent crime in Indian Country. Missing persons and murder cases are different issues that require different law enforcement responses. Federal law enforcement investigates all suspected murders in Indian Country, and U.S. attorneys' offices around the country work tirelessly with our law enforcement partners to turn those investigations into prosecutable cases. In many ways, cases of missing individuals can be especially challenging to law enforcement in light of the myriad of reasons that someone may go missing. However, we recognize that the term missing and murdered goes beyond investigative procedures or legal definitions. Missing and murdered has become a call to action to address the crimes and public safety conditions that result in lost loved ones, including domestic violence, sexual assault, substance abuse, and inadequate law enforcement resources. As stated in President Trump's proclamation on Missing and Murdered American Indian and Alaska Natives Awareness Day, we must work together to correct these injustices. The Department of Justice is expanding our efforts to respond to this call to action. We are working closely with our colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Institute of Justice to better understand how data on reports of missing or murdered women are collected, how often these numbers are updated, and what protocols are required to resolve reported cases. We have begun a targeted effort to educate federal prosecutors and law enforcement with an ultimate goal of establishing improved and more standardized protocols for data collection, reporting, and case management. Ongoing coordination in Montana further illustrates the department's commitment to a collaborative approach to address the missing and murdered issue. On June 12th of this year, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Montana Department of Justice, the FBI, and the BIA co-sponsored a day-long missing persons training for both law enforcement and the public. Our goal was to inform law enforcement and the public about the problem of missing Indigenous persons and the various missing persons databases and alerts. In addition to honing our law enforcement response to reports of missing or murdered people, the department is advancing our technology to better support law enforcement and families investigating these cases. Our technological advancements include expanded efforts to assist tribes in integrating Amber Alert protocols, Our Office of Justice Programs, or OJP, provides funding and technical assistance opportunities to integrate tribal Amber Alert communications plans with state or regional plans. And that helps us to better align our resources with the needs expressed by tribal representatives. Amber Alerts have become a critical tool in responding quickly to reports of missing persons. Another one of our key systems is the National Institute of Justice's National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, or NamUs. NamUs was developed to help identify unidentified remains, locate missing persons, and bring resolution to victims' families. NamUs is a national, centralized, web-based information clearinghouse and resource center for missing, unidentified, and unclaimed person cases. NamUs combines technology, forensic services, and investigative technical assistance to support and assist law enforcement officials, medical examiners and coroners, allied forensic professionals, and families from across the country. NIJ and NamUs staff have launched a targeted outreach and training campaign to tribal law enforcement, leadership, and community members to ensure Native communities are aware of the NamUs technology and technical assistance, which are available for free to all tribal nations. Finally, the department recently announced our 5th expansion of the Tribal Access Program, or TAP, which provides federally recognized tribes with the ability to access and exchange data with the National Crime Information Databases for both criminal justice and non-criminal justice purposes. This access to information empowers tribal law enforcement to respond to reports of crime and missing persons in their communities more swiftly and more effectively. Access through TAP also enables tribes to coordinate more effectively with other law enforcement agencies involved in responding to crimes in Native communities. The high statistics on crime in Indian country motivate all of us who dedicate our professional lives to partnering with tribes to improve public safety in Native communities. We're all mindful of the deeply personal and often too heartbreaking stories faced by individuals, families, neighbors, and friends. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss the serious issue and the department's activities in support of Native communities, and I look forward to addressing any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank the expert witnesses for their powerful testimonies, reminding members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chairman will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Addington, in your testimony, you mentioned that gaps in data pose great obstacles to murdered and missing Indigenous women investigations, and that alleviation of such gaps remains of importance to BIA. What initiatives has your agency undertaken to remedy this issue and alleviate gaps in the data?
Thank you for that question. One of the things that we've done is we partnered with NamUs to actually try to start gathering up the missing and murdered cases that's still active throughout Indian country and actually get them into a system where we can actually have the data, where we can actually pull a report and see exactly how many cases there are. Currently, there's not a system in place that we can just go to at the BIA and pull that data, because some cases are worked by other agencies as well. So we're working with NamUs to actually try to get all the BIA has already been I put a policy in place that we will enter all of our data into the system, and we're trying to get the tribal programs, encouraging them to enter their data as well. So once we get those cases entered into the NamUs system and using the new data fields, that's going to give us the opportunity to be able to pull a report and see exactly how many cases that we've got out there, so we can start working on investigating cold cases or cases that's active that we're not aware of that may be older. So that's what the department's doing right now to address it.
So, and kind of sticking on, since we're talking about NamUs, in your testimony, you mentioned your work along with NIJ to improve the NamUs database so it can better address the MMIW cases. NamUs has been around now for about 11 years. However, it's taken over 10 years to add basic tribal affiliation data fields to its systems. Why did it take the Department of Justice and BIA over 10 years to see the flaw in their data? Second question is, prior to tribal affiliation data field, what was used in place of tribal affiliation data field prior to that to actually collect this? And i.e., were all crimes listed as just Indian or some other type of category?
Prior to 2012, 2013, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we actually collected additional data from the tribes and the BIA programs, specifically to BIA that was outside of the UCR data. So once we started just submitting the UCR data, we quit collecting that information because of getting the information transferred from the BIA over to the FBI in a exportable file from the tribes became really burdensome for the tribes. So we tried to streamline that process, which caused us not to collect that data anymore.
And on that note, so what's going to happen with that data, and I know this is getting really nerdy for you, but what's going to happen with that data of previously collected information that was used as sorted differently than it is now in the NamUs system?
The data we collected before didn't have the specific data fields where it broke the data down. We just collected the numbers from the tribe, so like missing person numbers, but it didn't go into detail of the cases or anything. So by working with NamUs and adding those specific fields in there, we can actually determine what their tribal affiliation is, whether they come missing from Indian country or off of Indian country, because of course we only have jurisdiction on Indian country for the BIA. So we can actually pare those down and see specifically where the cases are coming from and differentiate between the state cases and the BIA cases, or the federal cases.
To follow up, back in December 2018, you testified before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs in a hearing titled Missing and Murdered, Confronting the Silent Crisis in Indian Country. We read your public testimony then. I've noticed that the testimony you submitted this week is very similar to the testimony that you had last December. In fact, it looks like an entire paragraph of your current testimony detailing BIA's new training program initiatives has been copied and pasted verbatim from your prior testimony. So with that being said, what is in recognizing that we are in dire straits in the status of missing murdered Indigenous women, how do you explain what the BIA has been doing in the last year? For me, from my perspective and the staff perspective, what we've seen is nothing but inaction. So I'd like to understand what is the actual actions are going to be coming out of this. And please explain to us what other tasks or actions your office has taken in regards to dealing with MMIW.
Well, the one thing that we've done is expand our training and our awareness out there. Getting more training out to the Indian country law enforcement programs was crucial because we identified that there was some response issues in some of the previous cases that we reviewed. So getting additional training out there so folks know how to respond. Because a missing person report that comes in isn't necessarily a crime when it's reported into one of our police departments out there. So we have to treat those with more better response. So that's what we've tried to put in place to make sure folks are trained. We've redone our policies internally to make sure that we've strengthened our policy on the response of missing person and abducted persons for the BIA as well. And then we've started holding sessions to listen to tribal leadership on what the issues there actually are out in Indian country. And we're looking at different options like cold case task forces, different things like that to actually start addressing some of these cases that's out there that's not been solved over the years.
Okay, well, I'll come back to this. Now I recognize Member Cook.
Thank you very much. You know, when you were talking, you mentioned the Amber Alerts. For years, we never had the Amber Alerts or similar programs where you could highlight it right away. And I know you're doing that, but I'm not sure if it's coordinated. And can I get some feel whether that would immediately go out through all of Indian country or what have you when we have somebody missing or we have a tragic situation where people might have data that could help law enforcement? I'm just not getting a good feeling because in California, we tried to do that for years and never got that way until finally it was adopted and it was a great program. So, and here's where I'm going, and I'll let you comment on this. Because of the seriousness and the importance to this committee, to the subcommittee and to the whole committee. I'm wondering if we should elevate this to the situation where at least you could send us as people that have oversight responsibility and enact laws and regulation that, hey, well, what is this? You've had 3 Amber Alerts in this area here. What are your recommendations? What's been done? And I don't want to micromanage, but the situation is so bad right now that I was in the Marine Corps. It needs command attention. So what I was just suggesting in terms of influencing us on this with the circumstances and recommended action, including, if need be, suggested legislation. What do you think of that proposal?
Well, thank you for that question. I absolutely think the Amber Alert system should be expanded, and we do have some Indian country programs that actually have able to make Amber Alert notifications, and we have some states that actually have a state system as well. So we try to get the information out when something meets the criteria to do an Amber Alert. We try to get the information out as wide as we can in those situations. And there's also some localized situations. If we have a missing person that may not reach up to an Amber Alert situation, that we actually have some notification systems locally that we can actually get that information out so we can be on the lookout for that person before it becomes a criminal offense or they get harmed.
Yeah, and I don't want to continue on this, but I just want to emphasize again, we had a situation a number of years ago where a number of people were killed, and it ended up that it was the same murderer, somebody in law enforcement, I might add, that had some real problems, actually committed a crime, and and I won't go into that, but the DNA evidence, everything else, which has moved light years in the last decade, I would say, that we can share all over, and if it's not being done or something like that, then I think, and maybe I'm speaking just for myself, not on behalf of the whole committee, but I think a lot of us are just frustrated in the short time that we have in Congress. We want to do something because the stats and the number of folks are just unsatisfactory right now. So I'm looking for suggestions, proposals that we might have as part of an oversight, or even, as I mentioned earlier, with law to do this. How many people got killed in California because nothing was done when people didn't even recognize? It's a large state, granted, but they were all over the state, and somebody finally came, wait a minute, we got the same killer all over the place. I'm not saying that's the scenario, but I think loud and clear, we want to be involved, and I think that at least some type of Amber Alert to at least this committee should be in order, what happened, the circumstances, and recommended congressional action, if any, should be taken. Thank you. That was just a comment. I yield.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize Chairman Raul Grijalva.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Recently the Trump administration hosted a roundtable discussions on the theme of reclaiming our native communities with tribal stakeholders. In BIA testimony, you acknowledge these discussions and notes that the roundtable occurred in Zacatán, Arizona last May. However, DOI's online press release states that the discussion occurred at Zacatán on June 11th, and that representatives from BIA, ANA, and were both present at that particular roundtable discussion. However, it still remains unclear how many of these discussions occurred. You can evidence that by the date discrepancy and what was established at them. So, Commissioner Hovland and Deputy Bureau Director Addington, is there a public readout or transcript from this roundtable that's available to the committee or to the public?
There is not yet. We've held 3 so far.
And so I'm assuming you'll release public information related to who attended the meeting and general notes and summaries regarding those meetings? Is that an assumption when you're finished with these roundtables?
I'm not sure if something will be released to the public. I know the information will be used for tribal comments and what the tribes are wanting us to do in those
Do you
communities.
consider this tribal consultation in any way?
No, these were listening sessions with the tribal leadership.
So concrete plans of action were proposed or considered during these discussions, or was it more of a open-ended kind of a discussion?
No, we did discuss some of our thoughts on cold case task forces and some of the things that the department would like to do to address some of these issues. Those were discussed. We did a presentation for tribal leaders, but we wanted to hear from the tribal leadership of what their thoughts are and what ideas that they have to address these issues in their community, because they're best to know what's going on in their communities.
I think there's a great deal of interest in that on the part of the committee, and certainly the chairman and ranking member, to have as much information as available from these hearings in order to continue to be, to not only be informed, but to know what direction we need to be taking as, legislatively. Again, Mr. Addington, let me, a couple of questions, and that has to do with the comments that you made, in your testimony relative to the, you highlighted the importance of the Violence Against Women Act, specifically how legislation has helped illustrate to federal agencies the higher rates of violence against women in Indian country. Would you agree that the Violence Against Women Act needs to be reauthorized?
Yeah, absolutely. Any tools that we can give Indian country to better enforce crimes against our Native women and community members, we do definitely support.
How many officers are currently on staff within BIA's tribal police forces? And is that a sufficient number to deal with the crisis that this hearing is about?
Well, I can tell you, law enforcement programs throughout Indian country are all under-resourced right now. It's been very difficult to recruit, not only for tribal law enforcement programs, BIA programs, but either other federal agencies and state agencies. We've talked to a number of leaders in these different law enforcement programs, and everyone is running across the issues of recruitment. So they're definitely not resourced where they need to be, or every one of them is not. Some tribal programs are better than others just because of the location that they're in, and they're able to find applicants for law enforcement programs.
So it's insufficient.
I think we could always use more resources, yes.
Madam Commissioner, in your testimony, you mentioned your work this year with the Interdepartmental Council on Native American Affairs. Could I ask you who's involved in the council, what types of policies or plans are proposed on the specific issue for this hearing, murdered and missing Indigenous women and human trafficking issues? And is it available, that information available to the public? Is information about these meetings public or not?
Thank you for that question. So the Interdepartmental Council on Native American Affairs was established by law under the Native American Programs Act. It is an internal work group designed really to ensure that at HHS, when we are developing policy and budgets that affect Native Americans, that we are working collaboratively. So it's our internal work group, and we have met 3 times. Yesterday was our 3rd meeting, and it's leadership across HHS, so SAMHSA, CMS, HRSA, IHS, ACF, all of the stakeholders.
Okay.
And so, yes, MMIW is, as well as how it cross-sections with opioids and substance abuse and human trafficking, is one of our priority areas. We receive our input through tribal consultations, the Secretary's Tribal Advisory Council, which is taking place this week in Washington, D.C., as well as next week in Temecula. I'm hosting consultation, and we'll have a couple of hours for tribal leaders to visit with the ICNA body.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And my time is up. I will have. Okay, thank you very much.
More rounds of questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now recognize Representative San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you imagine if the women murder rates in Washington, D.C. were 10 times the national average? Or can you imagine if the women murder rates in Los Angeles or Chicago or Houston or New York or Miami were 10 times the national average? We would be alarmed to no end. But what makes these statistics even more horrific is that our indigenous populations are already distressed populations. So they are 10 times the national average in already distressed populations. And so as I take all of this in, I'm a new member of Congress. It's been an honor to be a member of this committee. I'm the representative from Guam. I have an indigenous population on Guam. We are an unrecognized people. Hopefully one day we can be. But one of the things that scares my people from even being recognized is the fact that we have these kind of statistics that go unaddressed in already existing recognized peoples. And constitutionally, the responsibility of this country rests here in this Congress to be able to address these kind of concerns. And as I listen to the testimony, I hear a lot of movement, but I'm not quite certain that there's going to be actual outcomes. And so my question is very specific. If we have a statistic that says that the murder rates for our women in indigenous communities is 10 times the national average, what is the timeline for us to drive this figure back down to the national average? Are we going to drive it down in the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? What is the timeline for us to be able to anticipate when we're going to be able to come back to this committee and say that we've solved this problem and we are no longer so egregious in these kind of statistics?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I wish I could tell you a time frame. I wish I could tell you we'd come back here in 6 months, a year, 2 years, and have driven those rates down to an acceptable level. Not that there is an acceptable level of murder in our society, but the points you make are fair ones. I can tell you from the Department of Justice's activities, we are actively engaged, along with our federal law enforcement partners, in making every effort to reduce the unacceptable levels of violence that we do see in our tribal communities. In my office, we have 11 full-time prosecutors who are dedicated to working with our federal law enforcement and local and tribal law enforcement partners in investigating and prosecuting criminal cases, principally violent crime cases that occur in our tribal communities. I serve on the Native American Issues Subcommittee of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee, and it is an exceptionally active subcommittee that works to address on a holistic, comprehensive level the issues of violent crime that we see across the country in our tribal communities. The short answer is I don't have a time frame for you. I wish that I did, but we are actively engaged. We are devoted to pursuing criminal justice in Indian country, to investigating and prosecuting cases to the best of our abilities. I continue to be hopeful, as I know my federal law enforcement partners do, that those efforts will ultimately yield a reduction in the unacceptably high rates of violent crime in our tribal communities.
Thank you for your question. I really appreciate that. At the Interdepartmental Council for Native American Affairs, we discussed we are going to be setting goals and benchmarks. We're in the process of that. As well as I am Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Administration for Children and Families. And really at ACF, we're designed to help strengthen individuals, families, and communities. And there's a lot of great things taking place in our Native communities through their ACF programs. And so we are going to be visiting some of our tribes that have great one-stop shops, because that's what we're hearing is there needs to be a one-stop shop, a wraparound of services, and then encourage that in other communities. But also wanted to let you know that I had the honor of traveling to your homeland this summer with members from our ICNA group, the Interdepartmental Council, and had a great roundtable that was hosted by your governor and lieutenant governor on human trafficking, and we are working in partnership with them to be able to come up with this strategy. Again, we want to be respectful of culture, which is why we are trying to get to the different regions and develop them.
My time is running short. I appreciate the answers. I'm sure, Mr. Addington, you'll say something similar. The reason why I raised the point in the beginning of my statement about how this would be considered a national crisis if it was a statistic affecting any one of our cities is, appreciating the work that you do, for us not to be able to have a concrete timeline and to be acting with a sense of urgency underscores the fact that, we need to do a lot more than what we currently are. And what this Congress needs to do to support you, I think, is something that we'll be more than willing to entertain. And so I would suggest that we work to a level where we develop the strategy to be able to come back with a timeline. If this was happening in DC or LA or Houston or New York or Miami, we would have a timeline. We would say we're going to drive this down in the next year or the next 2 years. But for us to be able to say, we're going to do our best, I think is just, it's very sad. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You now recognize Representative Case of Hawaii.
Thank you, Chair. Like my colleague from Guam, I represent an indigenous population. I represent the indigenous peoples of Hawaii, the Native Hawaiians. There are well over 500,000 Native Hawaiians living in our country, of whom roughly 300,000 live in Hawaii proper. This number is obviously much larger than many of the federally recognized tribes. And they also suffer from many of the indicia that you have identified in your testimony, whether it be outright missing and murdered indigenous women, Native Hawaiian women, to domestic violence, to crime rates, to sexual assault, to lost loved ones. Every indicia also impacts Native Hawaiians. And I say this not only on behalf of Native Hawaiians, but on behalf of many indigenous peoples throughout our country who don't fit easily into your definitions of Indian country and tribes and reservations and all of the more structured federal, 150 years worth of law dealing with indigenous peoples. And I think that sometimes they get left out of this equation. Certainly, I know that Native Hawaiians feel that they are often treated as an afterthought by their federal government when they are indigenous peoples and when they deserve the same attention, when they have the same consequence, deserve the same attention, the same programs. And so, testimony that is Native Americans and Alaska Natives that doesn't also say Native Hawaiians is just a knee-jerk reaction from me. Why not? And I'm sure the gentleman from Guam would feel the same way. So first of all, I want to make that point because every time we talk about any issue in this subcommittee or in your work, I hope you always think about Native Hawaiians and other indigenous peoples beyond what you consider Native Americans and Alaska Natives. Number one. Number two, in that vein, have you considered or consulted with Native Hawaiian community, which is structured and represented, including the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations in the Department of the Interior, an existing office, on this particular issue? So in other words, has there been outreach? Has there been inclusion? Has there been consultation? And if not, can you do that? Ms. Hovland, I think you're probably the appropriate person.
Thank you. Yes, under our statute, under the Native American Programs Act, Native Americans are defined by law, which includes Native Hawaiians and the Native Pacific Island relatives also. So yes, during that period that we were in Guam, we were over for 2 weeks in the Pacific Basin, and we actually had 2 days of roundtables, which we partnered with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And we had, one of the topics was human trafficking and murdered indigenous peoples, and we had law enforcement there since Interior does not have jurisdiction with law enforcement. We also did have the Department of Interior's Insular Affairs present, and we had very good dialogue. We were working with those stakeholders that were identified as we develop, again, a plan specific to their communities and considering the culture. So we want the community members to lead it, and we will help develop the framework and see what services we can provide to support that.
Certainly willing to work with you on that on behalf of Native Hawaiians, and not just in Hawaii, but everywhere. And then to Mr. Addington and Mr. Anderson, any particular comment on focus or inclusion or consideration of Native Hawaiians and perhaps other indigenous peoples not within the structured federal regime?
Well, for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, of course, like Ms. Holland said, our problem is that we have no jurisdiction there. So that's one of the reasons we haven't engaged in that side of the house. Is we're trying to come up with some concrete solutions and things for places where we have jurisdiction and where we have a need for resources right now.
Fair enough. Well, we would like to get into your jurisdiction at some point.
You bet.
Sir, Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, Congressman. I would have to get back to the committee about what the efforts are particular to Native Hawaiians. We do have jurisdictional issues there insofar as it is not considered Indian country for purposes of the federal law enforcement.
Fair enough. But from your perspective in the Bar Association and the other efforts that you are going through, please just consider my comments and take that back and log it into your thinking whenever you're dealing with these particular issues. I appreciate the effort.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Representative Case. And now recognize Representative Holland.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Before I begin my brief statement and questions, I wanted to recognize Navajo Nation Council Delegate Amber Crotty, who worked tirelessly on the PROTECT Act, which was signed into law that makes tribes eligible for federal grants from the DOJ to aid in implementing the Amber Alert system, and has worked tirelessly on the Navajo Nation and the state of New Mexico on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I thank you for being here. Before I begin my questions, I would like to briefly state that the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue has been one of my top priorities this Congress, and I thank each of you for being here today. Really appreciate you coming and speaking with us. The United States government has a trust responsibility to Indian tribes. Statistics show that 8 in 10 Indigenous women will be raped, stalked, or abused in the course of their lifetimes, and the National Institute of Justice has stated that 84% of Native women experience violence. This crisis has very deep and long-standing roots in our country, something that just didn't start a few generations ago. On some Native lands, Indian women are murdered at more than 10 times the national average, so we can see why. As a topic of discussion, that we need to take action to stop this silent crisis. This week is the 25th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act, which has critical provisions for Indian country to protect Native women, but more work must be done. The Violence Against Women Act was passed in the House in April of this year, and it is yet to see the light of day on the Senate side. It bears repeating, is yet to see the light of day on the Senate side. My first question is for Mr. Anderson. Thank you so much for being here with us. From New Mexico. I introduced the Bridging Agency Data Gaps and Ensuring Safety Act, which partly focuses on law enforcement data sharing with tribes through the DOJ's Tribal Access Program, TAP in the acronym. Your agency has previously stated that only about 75 out of 573 tribes will participate in TAP by the end of 2019 fiscal year. And this seems really low. Do you believe that TAP is underutilized by tribes, and why, in your opinion?
Thank you, Representative. TAP is a valuable tool to promote the sharing of information between tribal law enforcement and obtain tribal law enforcement access to national criminal information databases. My colleagues at the Office of Tribal Justice within the Department of Justice are proactively working to roll out the TAP to more tribes across the country. I expect that we're at this rate, we are getting it out to 25 tribes per year, and by the end of 2020, we hope to get TAP Lite, which is the software exclusively as opposed to the hardware, out to all tribes that have their own law enforcement agency. So it is actively being pushed out. In terms of it being underutilized, I think it depends on which tribe we're talking about. As a rule, I don't believe it's underutilized. I think it has provided a valuable avenue for tribes and tribal law enforcement to obtain access to those national databases.
Thank you. And so when you say that it's being rolled out to more tribes as we move forward, What's the application process like for tribes to participate in TAP each year? And do you believe that the application process is any type of barrier to their participation?
No, Representative, the application process, there is an initial application that simply requests information about the tribal infrastructure, whether it's what type of tribal law enforcement exists, what type of administration capabilities there may be. So there's an initial, I wouldn't even call it an application, I'd call it more of a vetting process to understand, help the department understand how the TAP can be utilized most effectively. I don't believe that consists or considers a substantial barrier to the tribal application and access to the TAP.
Thank you, thank you. I'm almost out of time. I'll try to fit this last one in. The Badges Act also requires BIA, this is still for you, Mr. Anderson. The Badges Act also requires BIA direct service officers and FBI agents with jurisdiction in Indian country to report missing persons cases in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System database, since there are currently large gaps in data collection, making it difficult for Congress to know how expansive this issue really is. Even though the FBI and BIA work together to process crime scenes and evidence collection, why do you believe the data collection is lacking, and where can these two departments improve their coordination to adequately collect evidence and data of these crimes?
Representative, I think the data collection where we are most in need of improvement is in facilitating the effective exchange of data between tribal law enforcement and the federal law enforcement counterparts. I believe that the TAP certainly would help that. The expanded efforts to improve public awareness of and access to NamUs and inputting data into NamUs would also facilitate that exchange of information.
Thank you. I yield, Chairman. Thank you for allowing me the time.
Thank you, Representative. We'll be doing a second round of questions, too, if you have follow-up questions. We're going to switch back to Mr. Anderson. Last December, the National Institute of Justice's Director of Investigative and Forensic Sciences, Gerald Laporte, noted that fiscal year 2018 was the first time that the Office of Justice Programs received funding from the Crime Victims Funds to meet the needs of Native victims. Does that mean that before fiscal year 2018, there were no funds specifically allocated to meet the needs of Native victims of violence? And if so, why?
Representative, I know that in fiscal 2018 and in fiscal 2019, there is a substantial set-aside from the Office of OVC funds, obviously for tribal purposes and to serve victims of crime within tribal communities. I believe there were funds before that, but I'd have to confirm that for the committee.
Could you, if you find out, can you make sure that my staff gets that information? Why do you believe you were sent as a designee from the National Institute of Justice if you can't really speak to their operations? You have a lot of great experience, obviously, as U.S. Attorney in New Mexico, with a state that has many of our tribal nations. But it's odd that you were picked specifically because we really need more information when it comes to the National Institute of Justice. In your opinion, did they tell you why?
I'm sorry, Congressman, why I was sent today.
Yeah.
I am heavily involved in the issues that the committee is here to address today. So I am active in the Native American Issues Subcommittee, very active in particular on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Hopefully, I like to think that I'm generally knowledgeable about those issues. My knowledge is not perfect, but I suppose I was deemed a suitable candidate because of my overall involvement in the
No doubt you're very knowledgeable. I guess we have a lot of questions that would have been, I think, better answered by somebody from the National Institute of Justice. But in terms of your personal experience, we're very well grounded there. In total, how much money was awarded from the Crime Victims Fund?
Congressman, I believe it was approximately $100 million. I know of the set-aside last year.
Do you know how long these grants go for? Is there a shelf life to them?
I don't believe I believe they're no-year funds.
Okay. Do you know?
3 years.
3 years, okay. Do you know who some of these awardees are and what type of programs are they specifically funding?
The OVC, the Office of Victims of Crimes funds, Congressman, is that? They can fund any type of program that is directly related to victims of crime. So, they are subject to applications, but any type of program, as long as it directly serves victims of crime, is eligible for funding under the OBC programs.
As now more speaking to your experience as a U.S. Attorney of New Mexico, as you're aware, there have been jurisdictional challenges that have impeded the prosecution of cases in the past, allowing crime against indigenous communities to go unpunished. What steps has your office taken to improve prosecution of these crimes and reduce barriers to enforcement in Indian country? And what can you recommend that other offices do the same as yours?
Congressman, are you referring specifically to jurisdictional challenges or challenges more broadly of prosecutions in Indian country?
Both. Let's just hit both.
Certainly. Well, on the jurisdictional front, one of the important things that we do is collaborate with our state and local and tribal law enforcement partners. So, given that New Mexico has a substantial number of pueblos, we also have the Navajo Nation. It's important for us in identifying where a crime occurred that we have effective communication and collaboration with those state, local, and tribal partners. A number of cases in my office really turn on the actual location of the offense and whether that is within the boundaries of a pueblo or Indian country as the term is defined by statute. So one of the most effective tools we have is that collaboration and identifying those boundaries and working with state, local, and tribal partners. I'd also point to the cross-commissioning that we do under a special law enforcement commission to allow those state and local partners to enforce federal law along with our federal law enforcement partners, and that ameliorates some of the jurisdictional challenges we face.
I now yield to Delegate Sanikas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Addington, I wanted to follow up on a statement you made earlier when responding to questions from Chairman Grijalva. You mentioned that there are impediments to law enforcement recruitment with respect to getting individuals to do that job in Indian country. Can you elaborate on what those impediments are and what the possible solutions could be for us to be able to fix that problem?
You bet. Thanks for that question. One of the things that we're seeing is nobody wants to get into public safety anymore like they used to years ago. That's one of the biggest things that we're seeing is just the applicant pool is just not there for positions. We advertise a position where we used to get maybe 15, 20 people on a applicant list, where now we're maybe getting 1 or 2, and it may be somebody that can't pass a background. So of course that person won't be able to go into that position because they can't pass a background. So it's the number one thing that we're seeing is just there's not enough applicants. There's not enough interest of getting into public safety programs out there. Then on the other side, there's a couple other things. The salary ranges for tribal law enforcement, BIA law enforcement, is lower than most other programs. They can go to work for a county or a city or another agency and, of course, make more money, work in get better equipment, different things. So that's one of the other obstacles that we have. We train folks and then they go to work at another program as well. But I think the number one thing that we're having a problem with is just getting people interested in getting into public safety in general.
So when you mentioned that the salary for BIA law enforcement is low, is that relative to other law enforcement positions that are outside of BIA?
That's correct. It'd be like other federal programs. We're maybe a grade step lower than our federal counterparts doing the same similar job in another federal program, but like counties, states, some of those programs pay well above what a tribal law enforcement program pays, because of course they're basing their salaries based upon the allocations that they receive to run their programs.
When was the last time we've had a wage study done for BIA law enforcement?
I don't know that there's been a specific wage study done. I know we've looked at our salary ranges a couple different times. We did a full Protecting Any Country report back in 2010, and then we looked at it again a year and a half ago, and still determined that the tribal and BIA law enforcement's salaries are lower than other programs.
But those evaluations and determinations are all internal.
Yes.
We've not, BIA has not engaged the services of a third-party wage study professional firm to be able to evaluate whether or not BIA law enforcement wages are maintained at the national average. I mean, if we're paying law enforcement on BIA below the national average, then it helps to really explain why we're having crime rates over the national average. So we have not engaged a third-party wage expert to be able to evaluate the wages of BIA law enforcement?
We have not went to a third party or anything, and it depends on where you're at across the country too. Some places we're comparable, or we may be above what a county sheriff's department is actually making. So it's relative to where you are across Indian country as well. So it's not just across the board. Every location is either being paid less or more. So it depends on what region you're in and what area as well.
So if the law enforcement salaries on the BIA side are below what they typically would get, even in other federal law enforcement positions, how is that salary range even determined?
It's determined on the GS scale. So and by the appropriations that we have for each one of those programs as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now I recognize Chairman Earl Grijalva.
Yeah, thank you very much, and a reaction from all three witnesses, and I appreciate your time very much. And it's unfortunate, as the chairman pointed out, that the National Institute of Justice is not here, because a lot of the pertinent questions that we have should have been directed to them. But let's just talk about some issues that are part and parcel of the whole discussion. And my colleague, Ms. Holland, kind of illustrated the piece of legislation that she has and that we support. But in terms of legislation, where we deal with issues such as salary parity, even within our own jurisdiction, this committee, we have law enforcement in our national parks, and I think that's a fair comparison, if it would exist, that salary parity is an impediment to recruitment and retention. And I think we need to look at that, and I appreciate that information. So that would be mandated. We would be mandating issues in legislation and codifying, mandating the points that the ranking member brought up about data sharing as a mandate. And as a mandate, the coordination and collaboration of interagency efforts. And victim support, training, and support for victims, families, and tribal communities would be part of something mandated, which is all part of discussions and legislation that's going around. Your reaction to the process that you're undertaking with no reflection one way or another on my part, and a mandated legislation that has a timeline when this has to be implemented. Your reaction to that? I mean, I know it's a general question, but something I think we have to also look in this discussion is what legislatively can we do to prod this forward and to set some expectation and a timeline, rather than to continue to have updates that frustrate some of the members, or certainly myself, in terms of what movement we're making. At least we'd have a benchmark. And your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think data collection is one of the things that we need to do promptly. I think there needs to be a timeline on what data is being collected, and it's mandatory that we're collecting that data so we know we can use that information to identify crime trends and what's going on out there. So I think I'm in full support of timelines on implementing new fields of data so we can share that data and collect it from everybody.
One of the mandates, of course, would have to be resources to support whatever legislative initiative.
Correct.
And if I can add, sir, one of the other barriers we've been identifying in our visits in the urban native centers is having a uniform code for when data is collected at screening so that they can transfer to other data systems, and it's a standard code, as well as having a lot of our native peoples are classified incorrectly at screenings because sometimes there is an American Indian, Alaska Native, or Pacific Islander on there. So that's another area that needs to be looked at also so that we can get better representation at screenings.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. And I recognize Representative Holland.
Thank you, Chairman. I have one last question for Mr. Anderson. As you are aware, urban areas like Albuquerque, where you are based, have high numbers of urban Indians due to the surrounding tribal lands and jobs, of course. Has your agency done any work to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis in urban locations with high populations of Native Americans, or have suggestions about what can be done to help reduce the number of missing and trafficked Native women, even though it's outside Indian country?
Thank you, Representative. And the last point you make is an important one, given our limited jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction in Indian country. And when we deal with Native populations and crimes committed against Native populations that live in urban areas, obviously the principal law enforcement responsibility falls to the local, state and local authorities. In terms of what we can do to facilitate communication, the types of things we've been discussing today in the nature of information sharing are going to be our principal priorities there. So developing protocols to ensure that information is shared between tribal law enforcement and local law enforcement, be it in Albuquerque or any other metropolitan area we may be talking about. I think that type of consistent information sharing, consistent protocols and procedures as between tribal law enforcement and local would go a long way toward addressing the type of missing persons issue we've been talking about today.
Thank you, thank you. And Mr. Addington, before I was sworn into Congress, I attended the Senate's oversight hearing on missing and murdered Indigenous women. That was back in December. Senator Udall, who has been a great lead on this issue in New Mexico, cited, quote, poor coordination, limited data, and insufficient resources, unquote, as barriers to solving these cases during that hearing. Your testimony also implies better interagency coordination and communication is needed. What has the BIA done since the December Senate hearing to improve interagency coordination, and what more efforts are needed from the FBI to assist your agency?
Thank you for that question. We work very closely with the FBI's Indian Country Unit on these issues. I talk to staff in that unit, if not weekly, every other week or every couple of weeks on Indian Country issues. So we do coordinate on response as well locally. We're actually working with our local FBI partners out in our service agencies to where we're coordinating and collaborating on making sure we get the proper response to these reports that come in for missing persons. And just an example, we had in 1 month, we had 80 missing person reports that come into one of our police departments, or a couple of them in Montana, in a month. And the coordination since then with the FBI and our other local partners has just greatly increased, and we was able to recover and find all of these missing persons, and it still goes on today. We still got a high number of missing person reports that comes in, and by our collaborating better with our other partners, we're able to respond to those more quickly, and we're able to recover those folks in a short time period. So I think since the last hearing, just us talking with our other federal, state, local partners, and the great work that the U.S. Attorney's Office Native American Subcommittee, we've been attending those meetings with them. They put a lot of different training sessions in place, and where we can talk and collaborate in those efforts as well. So I think we are getting to where we need to be to make sure that we're responding to these cases and getting adequate representation for those victims.
Okay, thank you. And it's ironic that the FBI, when they first became an agency, one of the first big cases that they solved were the Osage murders in Oklahoma Indian Country. And I think it's I mean, it's interesting that that's the first thing they did to really hone their skills as a bureau. And again, we have Indian country crimes that need to be solved. Do you believe the FBI is making adequate effort to assist in coordinating, collecting data, providing resources to Indian country for these missing and murdered Indigenous women cases?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it depends on the area. We have some areas where we've just got great FBI counterpart agents that's there that work with us, and it depends on, as it does with the BIA, the workload, where you're at, what's going on the resources that's available. So I think they do really well in some areas, and it's no different than a tribal law enforcement program or our programs. Some areas we still struggle just because maybe we don't have enough resources that's actually assigned to that area, and we work on trying to coordinate our efforts to make sure that one of us is responding and able to focus on those type of cases.
Chairman, I yield. Chairman, I yield, and thank you for the time.
Thank you, Representative Holland. I now recognize Ranking Member Cook.
Thank you very much. It's very, very frustrating because, you know, this is a huge problem, more so for the members of the audience and the tribes than me. But I know how to fix this. And I wish I had some grand solution to it. I think Congress has got to be more involved. Now, I was mulling over in this pea brain of mine about ways on how we could get attention or what have you, and I almost asked the committee to take a look at what the military has done, the House Armed Services Committee. They have what is called a combat readiness evaluation, and they have unit readiness. And basically, it's a report card. And when this first came in and I was in the military, I hated it. I didn't, well, how can they do this? This is micromanaging. But it forced you to do certain things in terms of whether money was being allocated in certain areas, reporting proficiency or efficiency, things like that, and how you would do this. The only reason it was successful, it was a federal program. It's not like you're asking one state to do it or a city or what have you. So if these statistics do not improve, I suggest that we're going to have some type of evaluation system to see where the shortfalls are, and even if it's incumbent upon this committee or the Congress as a whole to do that, because we cannot continue with these tragic situations where the bubble doesn't seem to be moving in terms of improvement. And I echo some of the statements. But I think there were a lot of things that came out today. This has been, a hearing which, it's depressing. It's depressing for everybody in the audience. But it's a hearing that has to be held because you're never going to make corrections, or you're never going to address the situation. And obviously, maybe the bottom line of this is, hey, this is going to stay on the radar. We've got to continue to find ways to improve this. And because right now, innocent people are dying, missing, and our job here, even more so than you, we've got to do something about it. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Cook. Prior to closing, I do want to say this is our second hearing, and I do appreciate the efforts that have occurred thus far. But we want to see more beyond listening sessions. We want to see actions. If there needs to be follow-up legislation, we will be here to be supportive of legislation. Obviously, we'd rather see things move faster and actually have process and protocols instituted at the department levels. But this is something that this subcommittee is not going to let go. We cannot allow women, thousands of women, to be disappearing a year And it's certainly our trust's responsibility here in Congress to make sure we do something about it. So there will be follow-up to this, and I hope to have a successful conversation next time about how we've improved the situation. I thank our panelists of expert witnesses for their insightful testimony and members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.